There is a village, forgotten by maps, carved between the cold ribs of the Black Forest, called Grubenheim. The fog there never lifts. It's as though the trees themselves exhale it. They say Grubenheim is cursed, not because of war or plague, but because every child is taught the same lullaby before they learn to speak. A lullaby that ends with the words, "She weeps beneath the birch tonight. Pale mother waits beyond the light." This is the story of Matthias Heller, a young priest sent to serve a village that didn't ask for salvation, only silence. Father Matthias arrived on foot. No carriage would take him farther than the forest's edge. The road was swallowed by vines, and no birds sang overhead. The villagers greeted him with wary eyes as if they'd been waiting for someone, but not him. The church stood in the center of the village, hunched and crooked. Inside, it reeked of mildew and wax. Beneath the altar was a trapdoor nailed shut with iron nails, its edges blackened like charred wood. That night, as he prepared his first sermon, a child wandered into the church, barefoot, wide-eyed, and humming the lullaby. "Who is the pale mother?" Matthias asked gently. The girl whispered, "She takes the children who hear her cry. She lives in the birchwoods under the hill." Then she turned, walked backward out of the church, and vanished into the fog. Over the next week, Matthias saw strange things. Children drawing stick figures with empty eyes and weeping faces. Old women hanging birch twigs above doorways like talismans. A woman named Elsbeth who sat rocking an empty cradle night after night, her baby long dead. Villagers avoided the woods after dark. But one night, drawn by a distant, high-pitched crying, Matthias ventured past the edge of the trees. There, beneath a dead birch, he found a tiny grave. It had no marker, just a doll with a split porcelain face staring upward. Suddenly, the trees quieted. Then came a sound, not a cry, but a long, gasping sob, as though something enormous had taken its first breath in centuries. Matthias fled. In the rectory's cellar, Matthias discovered a journal belonging to Father Kranz, his predecessor, presumed dead. She was a woman once, a mother. But grief carves more deeply than sin. When her child died, the villagers said she made a deal. Not with God, but with something older beneath the forest. Each year she must be mourned, or she comes to collect mourning. Her body was buried beneath the church, but the grief grew teeth. He realized the iron-nailed trapdoor beneath the altar was not to keep something out, but to keep her in. That Sunday, Matthias insisted the villagers attend a service. They came in silence, faces drawn tight with dread. He began the sermon, but the church suddenly went cold. Every candle snuffed itself out. From beneath the floorboards came a sound of weeping, so soft it almost sounded like wind. But then she rose. Through the cracks in the trapdoor, long white fingers reached. Wood split. A figure emerged, 8 feet tall, her skin ashen and thin, her face hidden behind a veil of wet black hair. Her arms were wrapped in soiled linen, like a mother who never stopped swaddling a child. She moved slowly, but the grief that followed her felt like drowning. Several villagers dropped to their knees, weeping uncontrollably, sobbing out names of children long dead. Matthias stood before her, clutching the crucifix. She raised a hand, not to strike, but to touch his face. "Why do you mourn?" she asked. Her voice was the sound of dirt over coffin wood. "I don't," he whispered. Her hand fell. The pale mother stepped back into the trapdoor, leaving behind only her veil. The next morning, the veil was gone. So was the trapdoor. No one spoke of it. But Matthias began a tradition. Each year on the longest night, he held a funeral mass, not for the living, but for the grief of the village. He made them remember so they wouldn't have to forget. And in time, the lullaby changed. She weeps beneath the birch no more. Her grief now kept behind the door, but every so often on windless nights, the church bells ring by themselves. And in the woods beneath the oldest birch tree, a porcelain doll turns its face to the stars, smiling. They said the lighthouse hadn't worked in decades, so why did I see it glowing from my window last night? It was in the autumn of 1968 when Ethan Cross returned to Glassmore, a crumbling village clinging to the edge of the sea. Years had passed since he last walked its cobblestone lanes. His parents had died young, and he had been raised inland by an uncle who never spoke of the coast. Now, nearing 30 and weary from city life, Ethan came back to claim the one thing left to him, the family home, and the secrets it kept. The house stood stubbornly on a cliffside bluff, a Victorian skeleton, its bones groaned with age. But it wasn't the house that unsettled him. It was the Glassmore lighthouse, a tall, rusted thing half swallowed by the sea mist. Abandoned since the 1940s, its glass crown was shattered, and the stairs within were said to have collapsed. Yet, on the first night, as Ethan gazed out the bedroom window, the top of the lighthouse glowed faintly blue, like an eye slowly waking. Days passed, and the village folk offered little warmth. They spoke in wary tones and crossed themselves when Ethan asked about the lighthouse. At the dusty local library, he found an old journal tucked between sea maps. The name inside was Thomas Merrow, the final lighthouse keeper. Its pages detailed oddities, seabirds flying backward, visitors arriving on nights they weren't supposed to, and voices in the surf that whispered his name. The last entry was dated October 16, 1943. It read, "The light flickered on by itself tonight. The sea was flat, but the fog was thick. I could see a man standing just beyond the shore, not moving, watching. I rang the bell. He didn't flinch. Then silence." On his fifth night, Ethan ventured down to the base of the cliffs, following a path nearly erased by bramble. There, among tide pools and black rock, he heard it. "Help me!" A child's voice, soft but clear, drifting from the surf. He turned and saw a small boy standing waist-deep in the waves, staring up at him with hollow eyes. But there was no child, just the sea, flat and gray. Later, he learned that a child had drowned there in 1942, the son of Keeper Merrow. And worse, that Merrow had vanished a year later. No body, no goodbye. Driven by fear and fascination, Ethan broke the rusted chain and forced open the lighthouse door. Inside, the air was thick with rot and salt. The spiral staircase, though crumbling, held his weight. Each step creaked like a warning. He reached the top. The lantern room's glass was shattered, rust etched into every surface except the lens. It gleamed like new. As he approached, a pulse of cold swept through the chamber, and the lens began to turn on its own. Outside, the mist thickened, swallowing the horizon. "You shouldn't be here." A voice, old and broken, rasped behind him. He turned. Nothing. He fled. A local historian finally confessed to him over tea and trembling hands. During the war, Glassmore became a signal point for Allied convoys. The lighthouse was manned day and night. But Merrow had grown strange. He spoke of dreams where the sea climbed the land, and a voice that promised eternal clarity if he let the light pass through. On his final night, the light spun wildly. Ships crashed, lives were lost. Marrow was blamed and locked inside the lighthouse by the villagers. But when they returned the next morning, it was empty. The final night came. Ethan couldn't sleep. The blue light flashed again. And now the villagers saw it too. They gathered, silent, on the beach. He ascended the tower again, drawn like a moth to the flame. The lens turned fast, humming. Below, the sea peeled back, revealing black stones carved in spirals. Then, the whispers came, dozens of voices, layered and chanting in a language not his own. Ethan looked in the mirror of the lens and saw himself, but not himself. His reflection smiled back, eyes gone dark and full of stars. Let the light pass through. He placed his hand on the lens. A sudden eclipse swallowed the moon. The villagers ran, the sea screamed. From the lighthouse, a beam of blue light burst into the heavens, and then silence. The light went out. The tower crumbled, and Ethan Cross was never seen again. Decades later, the village is gone. Nothing but stone foundations remain. But some nights, sailors report a strange blue glow off the coast, near ruins they say don't exist on any map. And if you listen closely on windless nights, you can still hear the whisper, "Let the light pass through." The sea was never kind to Wraithmore. Nestled against the rugged cliffs of a forgotten coastline, this desolate town had once thrived as a port in the early 1800s, until one by one its inhabitants disappeared. Now, only the wind and waves whispered through its rotting shacks and salt-worn streets. Only one structure still stood tall and proud at the edge of the cliff, the Wraithmore Lighthouse. And inside it, the lantern keeper still watched. It was 1987 when Jonathan Graves received a curious letter. He was a disgraced journalist turned ghostwriter, living a quiet, miserable life in Boston. The letter was brief, unsigned, containing nothing but a key, a faded photograph of a lighthouse, and 5 words written in delicate ink. "Come, Wraithmore needs its keeper." Jonathan had never heard of the place, but something about that photo felt familiar, like a dream he'd half forgotten. He dismissed it, but that night he dreamt of crashing waves, of a dim light pulsing in the fog, and of someone, something, watching him from the cliffs. By morning, his bags were packed. Jonathan arrived days later. Wraithmore was colder than he expected, draped in an unnatural fog that never lifted. The locals wouldn't speak of the lighthouse. An old woman spat at the ground when he asked for directions. A man at the inn refused to rent him a room once he learned where he was going. "Lantern's cursed," the innkeeper said. "Takes what it wants, won't let you go." Jonathan said nothing. The lighthouse stood exactly like the photograph, towering, elegant, wounded by time. Yet the light still rotated above, flickering faintly through the mist. But inside, there was no power, no fuel, no working mechanism. Still, the lantern glowed. Jonathan spent his first night in the keeper's quarters. At 2:13 a.m., he was awoken by 3 loud knocks, tap, 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 on the tower stairs. No one was there. Only a trail of wet footprints leading downward toward the sea. He followed them, barefoot and half asleep, but the trail vanished at the lighthouse door. When he turned around, a voice whispered in his ear, "You've come back." Jonathan screamed. The next day he found a journal beneath the bed, a logbook belonging to past keepers. The entries were maddening, half gibberish, names scratched out. One passage read, She walks in the surf again. The girl with no eyes. She calls for me, says I forgot her, says I lit the fire too late. Another said, "The sea gives, the sea takes, the keeper stays." And this one, most disturbing of all. Jonathan Graves arrives 1987, stays 17 days, becomes the lantern. He dropped the book. The ink was fresh. Jonathan began to change. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating. He'd stand in the lantern room for hours, staring into the fog. He thought he saw figures out there, men with missing faces, children drifting across the waves, a woman in black holding a drowned baby. Each night, the same 3 knocks returned, each louder than the last. He boarded the stairway door, but they came from inside. On the 7th day, the sea receded for miles. Jonathan stood on the cliff's edge, watching an impossible path reveal itself across the ocean floor, twisting stones leading to a jagged island that had never been on any map. The lighthouse's beam locked onto it. He followed. At the center of the island stood a ruin, a shrine built from whalebone and shipwrecks. There, tied to a post, was a corpse wearing his coat, his boots, and a locket belonging to his late wife, Margaret. The corpse opened its eyes. Jonathan ran, but the tide had returned. The path was gone. The sea swallowed him whole. Jonathan awoke on the lighthouse floor, soaked but unhurt. The lantern was burning brighter than ever, now a deep, blood-red hue. The tower walls pulsed like a heartbeat. He wasn't alone. Figures lined the room, ghostly echoes of previous keepers, their mouths sewn shut, their eyes hollow, all pointing upward toward the flame. A voice echoed, "The sea forgets, but the flame remembers. You belong to the light now." The logbook now had hundreds of entries in his handwriting. Names, dates, tragedies. It spoke of shipwrecks he'd never seen, storms he'd never reported, deaths he'd never caused. But one stood out. Margaret Graves, lost at sea 1972. The lantern was unlit. It all rushed back. He had once been keeper. He had abandoned his post, left the light cold. His wife had died in the wreckage of the Astrabelle, and in the moment her soul reached shore, there was no light to guide her. The sea had taken her, and she had waited ever since. Jonathan stood in the lantern room for what felt like days, weeks. He lit the flame each night, not with oil, not with matches, but with memory, with guilt. Each night, the sea delivered another soul, another wanderer lost in fog, drawn to Wraithmoor's cursed call. He logged their names. He welcomed their ghosts. And every morning the light grew dimmer, until one day it flickered no more. In 2003, a group of hikers found the ruins of Wraithmoor Lighthouse. It had long since collapsed. There was no lantern, no journal, no bodies, just an old rusted sign half buried in seaweed. It read, "The sea forgets, but the keeper never leaves." Some say, on nights when the fog is thickest, you can still see the red glow from the cliffs. And if you listen closely, you might hear 3 knocks.